guest Jill Rutter, have got worse is pretty long. Arguably, it just got longer with the publication of a new in-depth study by UK in a Changing Europe, where my guest Jill Rutter is a senior research fellow. So let's start with the overview. What were you aiming to achieve in this report?
So remember back in 2019, Boris Johnson fought that election on that famous slogan of "Get Brexit Done," and we now seem to have entered a time when both political parties want to really sweep Brexit a bit under the carpet, not really talk about it. But if you actually look at the sort of lived reality of Brexit, and you talk about talking about the sort of new border controls, which we're still implementing yesterday, there's still a huge amount of work going on. There's quite a big Brexit hangover that people inside government are grappling with. And one of the things is there's sort of lots of Brexit details where the implementation has been made much worse by the political turbulence of the last few years. If you change Secretary of State 2 or 3 times a year, or even 2 or 3 times a Parliament or a week, and each of them wants to put their own thumbprint on what you're doing, you end up with a sort of zigzag. Yeah, so it's just all very difficult. It looks to us as though no one has sat down at the centre of government and thought, well, we've done Brexit. That actually was our big promise to the electorate. How are we going to make Brexit really work in a cost-effective way?
It's a philosophical challenge before it becomes an economic one, because in order to sit down and make things work, or in order to sit down and fix things, you have to acknowledge that things are in need of fixing. Whereas Brexit supporters in the Conservative Party and beyond were adamant that the process would deliver untold benefits and advantages. Why on earth do we need to fix things when you don't need to fix the sunlit uplands, Jill Rutter?
So I think, if I were Kemi Badenoch or David Frost in a thought experiment of deep interest, I think I would say, actually, I do need to do things. I've now got these Brexit freedoms.
Right.
I do need to do some things to reorientate a civil service machine that's been used 50 years operating inside the EU. I do need actually to do some things to take those opportunities from Brexit. But one of the problems is that the government actually isn't particularly agreed on what those opportunities from Brexit are. So one of the things that comes out in our report is that a huge amount of time and effort in already overburdened Whitehall departments and regulators was taken up with preparing for the retained EU law bill, which you might remember, that great thing that was going to clear off that sort of backlog of EU legislation that Theresa May had transferred over onto the UK statute book to be ready for Brexit. And they were all preparing, going through this list of what did you need to say for whatever. And then Kemi Badenoch came in, listened to business, changed course, and actually said, well, rather than the default being getting rid of everything, our default now is we're going to save everything. Very, very different position. But here's our list of things we're going to get rid of. And one of the things we were told, talking to people actually, in the front line of regulation, running these regulators, was, well, we could have had a big strategic conversation about how do we want to regulate better? Where are there real opportunities? But actually, we had to spend our time and effort on this big make work activity that then came to nothing. So I think you would say there that, even if you think they're big Brexit dividends, they don't just deliver themselves. That needs a bit of thinking through and working through.
And if there aren't, you still need to replace the checks and balances, the systems, the machinery that was pooled resources with the European Union now have to become autonomous resources, which presumably sees an increase not only in red tape, but also in civil service staff.
Yes, there's undoubtedly been a huge, big increase in civil service numbers. It's been, since 2016, civil service numbers have gone up by over 100,000, so they've gone from under 400,000, the result of those cuts under David Cameron and George Osborne. It's almost a handbrake turn. You can see it in all the graphs, and it's now over 500,000.
And yet all of the secretly funded lobby groups who insist that we need a smaller state told us that Brexit would help to deliver a smaller state. An increase of 20 to 25% in civil service staffing rates is the precise opposite of what they promised.
I mean, you can't say they're all down to Brexit, because remember COVID, asylum and things like that aren't Brexit. But say, a third to a half, then it's right. And actually that was always unrealistic, because if you have to run a new global visa regime, if you have to institute controls at the borders, if you have to run your own trade policy, you would hope that the gains from doing that in a better, smarter way will bring some dividends, but you undoubtedly have to take on those new functions that previously weren't necessary because we didn't have a trade border with the EU, or we were just running a visa scheme for half the numbers and things like that.
I sat down with Humza Yousaf yesterday for the first time, the Scottish First Minister, and just something he said just resonated with me then as I was looking at your report. And he was talking about where Westminster went wrong after Brexit and what he would do differently in the event of Scottish independence. And he said we would move as Scotland. We would accept the result, presuming he wins, but we would absolutely make sure that everybody was on board with what was needed to be done in order to make us as efficient and as effective as we could possibly be in the new reality of post-independence. What you're telling me really, or what you're reminding us of or describing, is the absolute failure of the people who won in 2016 to embrace the new reality with intelligence and design.
I think it was a lot of denial about the sort of inevitable consequences of some of the things that you were doing. Of the sort of Brexit that was chosen, had you gone for something more maybe where Theresa May, not at the start, but might have ended up, could have had quite different implications, but we've never had a proper strategic discussion really about that. It's been done internally inside the Conservative Party.
If the government's majority rests in part upon the questionable, to be polite, claim that Brexit would be done, the response or the rhetoric of saying it is done, we need to move on, it's over now, we need to stop talking about it, I mean, it begins to make sense. But what this report describes and what you're describing is deep and avoidable damage that is being done, or deep and avoidable delay that is being imposed on sectors that desperately need help.
Yes, I think what this shows overall is a lack of strategic grip about Brexit. Brexit not just a negotiation project to get the trade and cooperation agreement.
You. I want people listening to understand. This is a sort of Brexit Remain proof. It's got nothing to do with whether you thought Brexit was a good idea or not. This is a look at the reality of it and making the best of it, whether you think you're making the best of a bad decision or making the best of a good decision. At the moment, they're not making the best of anything.
Yeah, have a plan and actually have the grip and address the real problems that are there. That's the sort of big message of this, and it's a message to whoever forms a government, because...
Well, we'll talk about Labour briefly. We're going to run out of time. Can you put a financial figure on it? We've got a number of civil servants.
So, very, very rough and ready, based on averages. We don't do that in the report, but around £1.5 billion for extra civil servants, but
just for the wage bill.
Yeah, but that will be costs. I mean, some will flow back in taxes and things like that. It's quite difficult to do those numbers.
And that figure's not over yet, presumably, because I keep hearing that we need more border checks. Harwich is not ready fit for purpose yet, but they'll need to staff Harwich. They'll need to staff all of these pallet checkers. Our friend Andreas at Greengrocer in Chelsea was here yesterday describing the paperwork that now needs to be done, whether it's online or on paper. All of that will need to be checked. So there's more hirings to come, presumably.
Potentially more hirings, though we end up charging businesses for those checks, so they don't show up in more public spending necessarily. They may add up as a burden on business.
So what do you want to see? And you'll allow me to suggest that you're far too impartial to do so, that you're unlikely to see it from the current government, but you mentioned both parties failing really to grasp this nettle. What could Keir Starmer say and do now that would warm you?
I think that either party post-election needs to actually think, we're now where we are. How do we do this efficiently, minimise the costs, and look actually and say, have we got the resources, people, direction in the right places to actually, deliver some of the possibilities of Brexit, and are we being realistic about what those are?
That's a fairly straightforward analysis. Jill Rutter, many thanks indeed. You're a member of UK, senior fellow at the UK in a Changing Europe, which is the hat that you're wearing today. I got confused because you're also at the Institute of Government, aren't you?
Yeah, it's not their report.
No, absolutely not. It's coming up to 12 noon and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. So the civil service is nearly 100,000 people bigger since Brexit, but still no clear vision of what the government's policy may be. That is why we won't be moving on, either as a country or indeed as a radio programme anytime soon. Still waiting to hear. Have we heard yet from the Minister for Women and Equalities about this egregious racist abuse of a woman